segment of the book, we're going to talk about the working class and the middle class. And I think you probably have heard how the middle class has eroded in the United States. And I know I sound like a intensely political person, and I trust me, I am not. But we are in a rather extreme situation politically and socially, and we had a long period of time where we did have a middle class, and that is eroding, and we're kind of devolving, if you will, historically into kings and queens and peasants back to where we were, 1,000 years ago. So she's going to get into this in the book a little bit, but cities become large from the Renaissance onward. The city increases all the time, but our dense populations provide opportunities for commercialization, and this is this image is pre-industrial revolution, but we do get into it in about 100 years. Skilled workers, laborers, restaurateurs, entertainers, and household workers. So it was a class distinction from the nobility. There used to just be nobility, farm workers, and more of like a servant class, if that makes sense. So this is a kitchen maid here, and her job was to serve the wealthy. And she's in a modest home in 17th century in the Netherlands. And she is elevated and dignified here. She's a subject worthy of a good-sized painting. This is kind of double the size of a piece of paper, but more and more in this era, we start to see what this is called genre painting, where you're painting the working class, as opposed to if we look at Bruegel, that's one of the images that we saw, those hunters in the snow. That's another depiction of the common man as opposed to kings and queens or a religious scene. So we're elevating them, these working class people, by painting them. Tendency, so we're elevating the domestic life. So it's genre painting. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. So we can compare with the Spring Festival along the river here in Asian culture, as opposed to this image in Europe. We are here in China, and this is the Spring Festival along the river. This is a little bit earlier than our other piece, 11th and 12th centuries. So it was commissioned by a member of the aristocracy, but it represents upper class concept of ideal middle class life. So we're depicting middle class activities. We're at a festival, and there's some shopping going on, and there's probably food vendors and things like that, and entertainment. But the wealth of details, it talks about the bustle and hard work of the merchant class in China. This one, La Grande Jatte. When we get into the Impressionists, part of the thing we love about the Impressionists is the celebration of leisure activity. But what we're really looking at, and if you study it a little more closely and read up on it, this is the middle class or working class. So this has changed the imagery that we're looking at in the late 19th century here. The Industrial Revolution, things are mechanized, so therefore the people who are working, idealistically, doesn't always happen, but the people that are working now a Monday through Friday work week, not a 7-day work week like they maybe had before, and then they have some time off, and they go to the public park, okay? This is not a private area. This is a public park with a pond in France. So we see everybody kind of just hanging out a day at the park. He's smoking a pipe. We have a dog and a monkey. I feel like that monkey isn't really there. It just seems kind of surreal to me. Pre-surrealism, don't get me confused. Or don't get confused. But we see a number of people having a good time and just kind of relaxing. So it's a collection of strangers outdoors on a holiday. Unlike villagers attending a local festival, the groups do not know each other. So we're in a public place. Previous to this, if we were in such a garden setting, you would likely know the people, and you would be on royal grounds, if that makes sense. So this is middle class dress. It looks fancy to us now. We're very informal these days, but that is not what we're looking at. We weren't looking at anything fancy. So middle class enjoying increased leisure time in the 19th century. I don't want to get too into pointillism, but this is a subset of Impressionism. The poor is another area that we focus on. Now again, we could get into this image in the same way some of the others do. We show the actual poor, which is an actual woman, and her kids were starving, and she has and they're filthy and they're not doing well. She's an Okie, a migrant mother in Nipomo, which some of you may know that area, but Nipomo is near San Luis Obispo, up that way. But a lot of people came from the Dust Bowl at this time in the 30s, and from the Midwest. Their farms failed, and there was nothing to back them up, and they lost everything, and they put all their belongings on a truck and drove out to California. So a lot of people are descendants of Okies. I'm actually a descendant of an Okie that moved to California during this time, a little bit later, a couple years later than this. But a lot of the poor that came to that area did starve to death, and she was sent, Dorothea Lange, famous photographer, was sent to document these cases. So in her, she was paid by the government initially, by an arts organization that the government paid for. Again, this was in a time not unlike the Harlem Renaissance, where there was some money and some care for artists and things like that. They were promoting them. So she went and she photographed this woman in Nipomo Valley, and she asked her if it was okay to take the photo. Now later, in reality, this woman was really upset that she was never paid, and this image sold over and over and over. Initially, it was published in a magazine, but it went on to a greater life of its own, and she was quite frustrated about the fact that she was portrayed in this way. But that's this woman's take on it. But we know this image, we've seen this image, and she is very frustrated. She's only, I think, something like 32 years old at this point with 7 children. And you can see she looks like a 50-year-old woman. She's had a really rough time. So she's showing signs of poverty, but these photos really did help end the Great Depression and put forth some public works where food was available to the starving at that time. Now again, things have eroded. Not a lot of those programs are not there now, but there was some goodwill for a period of time, partly to do with photos like these. Okay, art objects that indicate class status. So different kinds of art are often indicators of class. Art objects are made for and reflect the needs and tastes of specific classes. I think we know that if you think about it. Probably some images come to mind. So in Japan, classes were kept really distinct. I would say they still kind of are. The ruling class would be imperial family and warriors. The very poorest are the peasants. Middle class of urban dwellers began in the mid-1600s. So trade, and you think about Columbus and trade and all this stuff happening, 1492, 100 years later, there's a lot of interaction and money that's changing hands, and some people are getting wealthier. And there's a merchant class. It's not just the royals anymore. There's some other people in this middle area, okay? Not desperately poor, not ruling, but have bought and sold cotton or whatever it would be, and they've made some money, so then they wanted to have some artwork. So the warrior rulers commissioned large screens, sliding doors, and wall paintings to lighten and decorate their dark interiors. Uji Bridge is an example of these screens. These prints were modest and produced in large numbers. You could think of these kind of as sort of our modern day poster. And these ukiyo-e prints were eclectic in style, combining Japanese, Chinese, and later Western styles. And they were kabuki actors, beautiful young women, and landscapes. Now we look at this now, and I mean, there isn't really much to distinguish stylistically. There's some differences, but I would say this is a pretty stunningly gorgeous image, and it looks very refined to me. But it's a woodblock print, so it can be made multiple times. It can be made into multiple copies. So that was more for the middle class that we were talking about. So the merchant class could have some art on their walls when people came over, and have a few objects that they could afford. Not on the level of the royals, of course, but some other some prints, and then of course the subject matter is going to be a little bit different. We are going to end here with Watts Towers. Oh my gosh, one of my favorite all-time things in the world. Now, this is off of the Blue Line near downtown Los Angeles. It's in Watts, which is near Southgate, which used to be literally the South Gate of Los Angeles, the city. So we're slightly out of LA City proper. We are adjacent to Linwood and Compton here. And Simon Rodia lived in this complex here, and it's near a railroad track. You can't see that, but remember I mentioned the Blue Line. But the Blue Line was put into action, I think, in the mid-90s? No, early 90s. But prior to that, it was empty. And then prior to that, it had just a regular Amtrak type service. And often they would throw broken crockery out the window. And it just so happened that he would pick up a lot of this broken crockery, and he made this amazing piece. And there's no welding in any of this rebar. I don't know how he bent it. Nobody seems to know. But he made all these circular metal structures and then covered them in concrete. And it's 100 feet high, several spires. It's supposed to be like a ship, apparently, but a beautiful piece, very colorful if you get up close to it. But this was just a guy in his spare time working at this a little bit at a time, 1921 to 1954, reinforced concrete and found materials. So he'd work on some of this. This looks more concrete. These arches here, these are kind of more like concrete slabs right there. Some of them have shells. That looks like a shell one there. Some have glass, some have ceramic. So ceramic tiles. Sometimes you'll see a cup handle, but they go quite a ways up in the air, and he did this all by himself over a 33-year period, all done by hand.